Recording. There we are. And I will share PowerPoint. Hello everyone. Welcome to the NAGT webinar series. The NAGT webinar series is a one-stop shop for increasing our community's capacity in earth education. Webinars in our series feature novel and innovative work in earth education research and pedagogy, new teaching materials, and the classroom and professional experiences of people just like you. The NAGT webinar series is free and open to the public, and we encourage you to invite your colleagues to attend and join in the discussion. Before we start, please take a minute to review the Zoom controls on your screen as shown in the PowerPoint. Also, we do track attendance at these events, so if you would like to be marked as in attendance, please go ahead and change your Zoom name to something that resembles what you registered with, and I'll make sure to get you marked. And during the content portion of the webinar, we ask that you leave your microphones muted and cameras off, but please feel free to use the chat as a space for questions and discussion. Also, as a reminder, the NAGT webinar participants are expected to abide by the NAGT Code of Conduct, which applies to all venues, events, and forums associated with NAGT. I'll go ahead and drop the NAGT Code of Conduct link in the chat once I'm finished speaking, so you can review the details of the Code of Conduct. You'll be able to find slides, resources, and a recording of this webinar on the webinar homepage, and I'll send out an email when everything is ready to be viewed. You can also view the recordings and slides from other webinars in the webinar archives. Today's webinar is developing evaluation systems that value DEI efforts, and I'll go ahead and turn it over to our speakers for today.
Thank you, Ashley. We appreciate it. So welcome today to this interactive workshop. So we're going to be sharing out some information and data that our research team has been working on collecting over the past 2 years. But then most of the time that we really want to spend with you all is working collaboratively to really think about how we are valuing diversity, equity, and accessibility work within the geosciences. So I'm Megan Elwood-Madden. I'm a geoscience professor at the University of Oklahoma, and I'm the lead PI on an NSF grant that was dedicated to understanding how faculty perceive diversity, equity, and inclusion work within the geosciences and how they perceive that those efforts are valued within faculty evaluation and promotion and tenure systems, with an aim of basically building better ways, right, that we can value this work within the geosciences. I'm working with a team of fantastic researchers, including AK, Lori Schneider, Mashad Faz, Eleanor Martin, and Lynn Sorrigan. All of us are at the University of Oklahoma, and we're excited to share the work that we've been doing over the past 2 years with all of you and collaboratively build this tool set that we can share out with the broader geoscience community. Next, AK. So this webinar, this workshop, the proposal that we submitted was as a response to a call to action that has been kind of brewing over the last 5 years. I'm sure that many of you who are here know that the geosciences remains the least diverse discipline in terms of race and ethnicity within STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And that's despite having conversations around diversity, equity, and inclusion within STEM since the 1970s. But those conversations have been renewed over the last 3 years, and we are eager to help provide some context and broader information about how faculty perceive that work across the country. What we found is that many geoscientists are working towards a more equitable and inclusive community, that there has been kind of this groundswell, grassroots efforts that are happening in departments across the nation, trying to figure out how we can make the geosciences more diverse. But one thing that's come out of all of those discussions is that growing and then sustaining diversity in academia requires addressing campus and departmental climate and culture, and in particular, recognizing and rewarding equity building activities as valid faculty scholarship. That we need to shift or adapt, right, how we value faculty activities, how we value student activities, how we value staff activities within academia, if we want to sustain, right, these efforts and really build and a lasting, more diverse community within the geosciences. And in particular, we need to look at career advancement structures and how those affect folks from a multitude of different perspectives and backgrounds that are coming into the geosciences as we are working to diversify our field. Next, please. So this particular workshop was inspired by a previous workshop that was held around the same time 1 year ago, May 26th. And this was a webinar that was put on by NAGIT that had a group of panelists coming from diverse backgrounds that shared their experiences of their own pathways through promotion and tenure within the geosciences and the hurdles and opportunities, right, that were afforded them at their different institutions as they navigated that path towards tenured faculty. The panel, which we've listed out here on the right, discuss how professional efforts in DEI are undervalued in promotion and tenure decisions, and they shared some strategies to align DE efforts with institutions' values and mission statements to really try to connect the efforts that faculty are doing with the goals of the institution so that those can be more clearly valued in evaluation and promotion and tenure decisions. They suggested policy and institutional changes, and they highlighted that the geosciences should not erect or maintain barriers for anyone in their pursuit of excellence within the geoscience academic community. So at the same time that this webinar was happening a year ago, our team was collecting data from interviews and surveys around faculty perceptions of DEI work that was occurring within their departments, what faculty were actively engaged with, and then how that work was valued within evaluation and tenure promotion decisions. And I'm gonna pass it off to AK here, Dr. Kotash, to share some of the results of that work.
Thank you, Megan. So just to reiterate, our research focused on investigating the range of DEI labor occurring in geoscience departments, who amongst the faculty is participating in these DEI activities, and how and if these efforts are considered and or valued in faculty evaluation reward systems, including tenure and promotion. In order to address these questions, we interviewed 45 faculty, geoscience faculty over Zoom, and conducted a nationwide quantitative survey with 324 respondents. Just taking a quick look at respondent demographics I have listed there for both the interview and survey data. We defined race as overrepresented and underrepresented based on the extent to which a group is over or underrepresented in STEM fields compared to its proportion in the broader population. Both within the interview and survey data, most respondents hold overrepresented identities. Of course, we do want to acknowledge that these broad race and ethnicity designations are not expansive. However, more detailed and intersectional cultural specific classifications are not possible without increasing the risk of inferred de-identification in our study. In terms of gender, to include those who exist outside the gender binary, we've included those who self-identified as non-binary in the non-male category, and then all male study subjects self-identified as cisgendered. Regarding institutional type, participants were employed by either R1, R2, and PUI and two-year colleges, or two YCs or PUI, primarily undergrad institutions. And then in terms of rank, faculty self-identified as either pre-tenured, tenured, full, leadership, and non-tenured. In-depth analyses of the faculty interviews indicate that there are three major elements that affected the focus of DEI initiatives. These include institutional type, career stages and associated reward structures, and an individual demographics. These elements define and frame the broader understanding of academic reward systems and their outcomes. Of course, these three elements are intersectional, they're interrelated, and then this type of analysis kind of follows a systems theory approach that recognizes that changes in any part of those systems, any elements of those three might have implications for the other parts of the system. So the gears of this academic reward system that we're going to kind of delve into, they have complex relationships with one another. And of course, they're influenced and upheld by those in which it serves, which is faculty members. So the institution in which one is employed that houses that system and then kind of creates this ecosystem that we're going to look into further. Okay, so let's get into the interview questions. When faculty were asked what percentage of faculty in your department are actively engaged in conducting DEI work, PUI respondent, primarily undergrad institution respondent, said, yeah, I think last semester in URGE, it was like 100% of us that were involved in it. And that was just a voluntary thing. The semester, we've been working during faculty meetings and in between to work on these policies. So I'd say in some way, all of us are involved in it right now. An R2 respondent said, I'd say probably around a third. When I think about the people whose names come to mind that I know are chipping away and trying to do something, it would probably be about a third of the faculty. Finally, an R1 respondent said only one. It's the only one that was appointed to. It's like a notary or an accountant, check mark, check. We have one person in that committee, that's it. So looking at both the survey and interview data for this question, the majority of respondents stated that between 25 and 50% of their departments were engaged in DEI work. And interview data that's listed on the right with that bar graph, the majority of respondents stated between 0 and 49% of their departments are engaged in DEI work. When faculty were asked, from your perspective, is there an equitable distribution of DEI efforts across rank, gender, race, and ethnicity? If not, how is it distributed? A primarily undergrad institution respondent said, I'm elated and proud to say 100%. One of the things that we see, I think, in our graduates who go on to graduate school is a feeling of disaffectedness because the contrast of what they experience when they leave. They imagine that it will be like it is here for those things, and in most cases, it's not. An R2 respondent said, it is certainly skewed towards our women faculty, doing a lot of DEI related service and doing service that is thankless. The jobs that must be done that nobody else wants to do because they must be done. And then an R1 respondent said, I think the women and the minorities care deeply about this stuff and they're tired of putting up with it. It was their fight. I didn't want to get in the way, and now I think I need to be more supportive. It's still their fight, but I need to say I'm in there with you. I don't know if a lot of the men are all that involved, probably not the old guys. Okay, so again, let's look at interview data for then this exact question. The bar graph on the top of the slide just shows those who answered no if there's an equitable distribution of DEI work across rank, gender, race, and ethnicity. 69% stated that early career faculty members are the ones that are doing most of the DEI work. 62% stated that non-male, 29% stated underrepresented folks were doing most of that work. There is a small portion that said that actually everyone is doing it equally. That's 18%. And so taking a look into who actually said that, those who shared that there was an equitable distribution held leadership roles and were from primarily undergrad institutions. Finally, when faculty were asked, how does your unit consider DI work in faculty evaluations? A primarily undergrad institution respondent said, we do not have a really good sense for truly measuring DEI at what it should be at its core, as opposed to highlighting it on a professional activities report saying you're doing it. There's a lot of entropy around DEI. I think that's where it's almost like a spectrometer where you kind of sort out different characteristics of people who might succeed in one area of DEI, but maybe they can just rest and say, hey, you know what, I've got a really good core structure where I'm at, where I can talk about conflict minerals and all kinds of cases, but maybe I'm not the one to also be sort of taking the students out to lunch because it gets awkward. I think we also need to recognize not everybody has the same skill sets. An R2 respondent said DEI service is not seen as the same. There are certain types of service that seem to have more power than others. And so there's a hierarchy or an unspoken hierarchy when you do service. If you're asked to serve on a search committee, that's a position of power. And when you volunteer your time to serve on a DEI committee, that's not perceived as the same type of position of power, even though it takes just as much time. And then an R1 respondent said, it's very clear that the primary requirement for getting tenure is being an excellent researcher, and it is unclear how any details of anything else factor into that. So again, looking at the interview and survey data, the majority share that DI work is not valued or considered in faculty evaluation systems. Those who believe DI work was valued and considered held non-male and overrepresented and/or leadership identities. Similarly, in the survey data, most faculty stated that DEI work was not really or sort of considered in faculty evaluations. And so just to summarize some of the results with you, we definitely asked more questions than this, but given the amount of time, this kind of sums up what faculty really thought of. So less than 50% of faculty are doing DEI work. Those who are actually doing that are non-male, early career, and racially minoritized faculty that burden is falling on. 42 to 50% stated that DEI work is not considered or valued in evaluation and promotion systems. 82% shared that DEI work is voluntary and it's falling in that service category. Many believe faculty should demonstrate cultural proficiency and inclusive practices, but perhaps maybe not all the time. And then lack of time, resources and/or funding, and clear expectations and evaluative structures are main preventing factors in more DEI engagement. So again, keep in mind this systems theory and how each of these topics are coming out and how they relate to each of the gears. Of course, by exploring each of the factors of the system, we can create a general understanding of how those gears work and its influence on DEI initiatives and growth within your own institution. So I do want you to think what institution that you're coming from and then go through those gears, what role, and also what demographics that you're falling into. But I also want to mention that the future, there's future and present power in this Zoom meeting alone, and that we should be looking at ourselves as ambassadors of change. Of course, this means acknowledging self, peers, and students, why we're actually educators in the first place, and just recognizing the scaffolding powers and structures at play every single day in the classroom and outside. All career stages, all institutions, all individuals should be engaged in equity-minded leadership culture and change. This also just stems back from undergraduate to graduate. Those are future leaders in each of those steps. And of course, you're reinforcing the system at play here. So each of those steps need to be included. Each of those stages also need to be on the same idea that we need to be equity minded. We recommend tracking the metrics that measure the cultural health of your ecosystem that we're talking about and understand your positionality within the systems and also the mechanisms of change around you and your own system. I've just listed 4 institutions that have adapted their tenure and promotion policies to include and value DEI work and activities. For example, IUPUI allows multiple pathways to be evaluated holistically with transparency about expectations with DEI work. PSU allows faculty to change the percentage of research, teaching, and service responsibility. And they've also expanded on their definition of scholarship in reference to quality and significance. WPI also expanded on their definition of research to include aspects of teaching and learning and scholarship of engagement. UCLA has adopted an engaged scholarship approach that is multidisciplinary. And so it kind of blends the activities of the work in research, teaching, and service, and how it's not as easy to put it into each of those categories and that they're blended. And then they've also defined the term rigor, excellence, and impact in relation to the discipline and the community, and have requested DEI statements and promotion and tenure files, and not just within new hires.
Okay, thanks AK for sharing that wealth of information that we've collected over the last 2 years in those interviews and survey projects. We'll be happy to answer some questions about the interview and survey projects at the end of the workshop, after we've kind of done this collaborative brainstorming and development activity first. So we've really come together today, recognizing that there's a problem, right? Recognizing that there's frustration amongst the faculty around how DEI work is valued or not valued in evaluation and promotion and tenure systems. And so we'd really like to kind of work as a community, right, to address this issue. And really, we think it's most important and most effective when we're sharing ideas between institutions, that even though each of us are in our own institutional ecosystem, that we have ideas that may be useful in ecosystems that are similar to our own, or might even be completely different than our own ecosystem. So we're really today aimed at trying to crowdsource some solutions and share ideas across different institutions. So today in just a minute, we're gonna go to some breakout rooms and we're gonna ask folks to share ideas, right? Brainstorm DEI activities that you want to encourage or value in your department or your unit or your college or your university, and describe the impacts of those activities. Why is it important to value that activity? What impact is it gonna have on your students, on your faculty, on your broader community? And then you're going to have a big list of brainstormed activities. We're not going to be able to address all of those today, but we want you to pick a few that you are passionate about, and then think about how you would describe those, how you would document those activities in evaluation or promotion and tenure documents. So that's going to be kind of the second step within our breakout rooms. And then finally, as a group, we'd like you to identify 3 or 4 activities or criteria that go along with those activities that you want to develop a little bit more fully to then share out with the broader group. So the first activity is going to be a brainstormed list. We're going to do that quickly. The second activity is going to be you personally finding things within that list that you are passionate about, that you want to think a little bit more deeply about how we would actually go about including that in the evaluation system. And then finally, the third step is, again, doing this as a group activity, identifying a few that we want to share out and refining those so that we can share them with the broader community that's here today. So we are going to use for this activity a set of Google Sheets that we have already prepared here. With each of the breakout rooms has your own Google Sheet. So I hope that everybody can see the Google Sheet that I'm sharing right now. Yep, okay. So this is the Google Sheet for the PUI 2-year colleges. So for those institutions that are primarily focused on undergraduate education. And we've got 3 different steps here that I just outlined on the slide before. So step 1 is the brainstorming list. So we've got this whole big list that goes down to 20, but if you need more rows, go ahead and use more rows that you'll brainstorm some activities. And then the second step will be moving over here to refining those, and then finally working collaboratively to identify 3 or 4 that you want to share out with the broader community. So here in just a minute, I'm going to open up the breakout rooms after AK just shares quite briefly how we're going to divide ourselves up.
Hey, Katie, before we were yeeted, exactly. Enough said.
Okay, well, thanks everybody for participating in that wonderful kind of collaborative activity there in each of our different breakout rooms. I'm going to ask that each of the breakout rooms just take like 2 minutes to share out something that they think that they'd like to see included in evaluation or promotion and tenure criteria within their units or within all units, perhaps, ideally. So the PUI group, is there somebody from the PUI group who's prepared to kind of share what you guys have worked on? I've got it pulled up here
Yep.
in the Google Sheet.
Yeah, I'm going to speak for the group. So we talked about a bunch of things, but one thing that we all sort of agreed on as being important was incorporating universal design for learning approaches into curriculum. And so for a department, this would mean that all faculty would be on the same page regarding teaching strategies and can collaborate on teaching approaches, and students would have a more consistently inclusive learning environment. In terms of an individual faculty member's ability to document that, faculty could submit syllabi and examples of class schedules and activities as part of the teaching portion of a tenure packet. Courses could be, and this is the dream world, right? Reviewed by an external, educational consultant, professional, geoscience education expert. And then obviously student feedback via, whatever course surveys or student feedback is available at the institution. And this would be, could be included in the teaching narrative, as well as, again, dream world, external letters from a sort of external classroom observer, for example, as well as student feedback.
Okay, great. Thank you for that excellent work there, thinking about how that could be documented and then also actively included into an evaluation framework. Someone from the R1 group willing to share out a key idea that you guys developed?
I think I agreed to talk about this. So we talked about several things, but one of the things that we talked about was mentoring minoritized students through academic decisions and personal hurdles and kind of whatever comes up. And I think we talked a bit about like various quite big challenges with kind of giving credit for that, partly also because sometimes you don't want to reveal the identity of the student or too much about their identity. but yeah, we talked about how that would kind of promote a sense of belonging and yeah, generally be helpful, although there is kind of like, I guess, like the line of how much of this is part of your academic duty is not actually super clear, depending on who is your department chair. Yeah, we talked about yeah, possible things we could do. One is to sort of nominate students for awards and have them, you know, then have a list of the students you've nominated for awards, or you could keep track of how many hours you're spending doing this. And have, I suggested having some kind of more formal mentoring programs helps, because then you can sort of like have, say, I'm doing this mentoring and this much is being kept track of and this is not being kept track of, but like it kind of legitimizes the unofficial mentoring to have official mentoring. And then also kind of valuing a personal narrative submission for, yeah, evaluation.
Right. Great. Anything else from the R1 group? Okay, we'll move on to R2 so we make sure that we get all the groups covered. So someone from the R2 group prepared to share out?
Yes, so I'll share. We didn't get much time to talk, so hopefully I'll represent what the thoughts of my colleagues. So we picked 3 things that kind of hit different parts of the sorts of broad things we were thinking about. So one of them was kind of something that sounds kind of simple, but takes a good amount of time, which is having regular lunch or coffee meeting times between students and faculty to kind of personalize those 2 groups and help with interactions. And that would be to kind of promote the sense of belonging within the department. And that could be documented by kind of recording attendance. So the faculty that are taking the time to do that kind of informal discussions. Another aspect that was included in our list was kind of the engagement with the community and involving both faculty and students in community engagement. And so that is to kind of go beyond the ivory tower and involve the community in the sense of belonging of who benefits from our geoscience efforts. So that could be documented through kind of, participation, again, kind of who's involved in that work, and some outputs like, media articles would be one example. And then the third one that we have on our, that we picked for our highlighted is working as faculty with the admissions offices as well as student support and kind of student affairs offices, so that there's kind of a unified approaches to various ways of improving methods of recruitment and retention and fostering a sense of belonging among students, particularly from minoritized communities, which will, hopefully lead to especially better retention of a more diverse student population. And then that one to document is a little bit tricky, but things perhaps like committee membership in meetings, and particularly any kind of products that can come out of that, as well as just tracking student numbers.
Okay, great. And then the non-academic group, one of you prepared to share out one of these?
So we can be fast. Hi, it's Casey and Laura, and we were just 2. So we discussed possibly kind of a meta thing of just the fact that we're both at this training workshop seminar, and our, that's not known in our organization that we're participating. So how does that time that we spend on these kinds of things and the skills we develop here and the resources we bring back to the organization get valued? So in this case, it'd be more in, an annual employee evaluation where you're talking to your supervisor about, where you're spending your time on these kinds of activities. So have that as part of the review process, have a question on there where you're able to report back the skills that you're developing in places like this, but also how you plan on using that in your organization. Laura, I want to add anything?
Yeah, and I guess just a small part of that is we were thinking about the very specific idea of onboarding and the question around how we're bringing people into the space initially, and how we're kind of, you know, creating the framework from the very beginning of the relationship that we have with each other moving forward. So that, you know, includes a lot of what Casey just talked about. We talked about the idea also of, you know, continued goal setting from the point of onboarding, so there becomes an ongoing record of the work that a person, you know, coming into this community is doing. You know, as they're continuing to learn and grow.
Okay.
I wish
Great,
we'd had more time.
So I know that we are like at the end of our scheduled time for the webinar, and I want to respect everybody's time. So AK is going to share just one final slide here, kind of what we can do with this work. All of you have access to the entire Google Sheet. So while you're thinking about it, you might go up into your browser and bookmark it, right? So that you can get back to it. There are lots and lots of brainstormed ideas that did not get fully developed, right, into the final products that were shared today. But I think we can all kind of go back and get some inspiration, right, from those different brainstormed activities. AK?
Yeah. No, thank you all for participating and sharing your ideas within the breakout groups. As Megan said, obviously those activities will be there, and this is kind of that stepping stone to developing them and getting them to that end where for some folks it might be the admin buy-in, and just having all of kind of your ducks in a row, in a sense of starting with the activity, having a document and having the impacts, then the documents that support it, and then also where that would fit within your evaluation structure. Of course, maybe your evaluation structure doesn't actually doesn't have it in there, and maybe it would be actually stretching what those words would look like in your evaluation structure. I know for two-year colleges, research really isn't in there, but what does it mean with teaching if there's research involved? Like, can that be stretched into what you're actually being evaluated on? So again, developing methods to include those DI activities for folks who are doing research, and how it might not be actually reinventing the wheel, it may actually be the activities you're doing right now. It's just making them more inclusive and making them more expansive, and supporting students and having them feel a sense of belonging. Of course, including universal design approach that values those ranges. And then of course, encourage and reward professional development around those. Actually reward faculty for doing it. And of course, making the argument that it is important. And so again, I want to thank you all. I know NAGT is probably going to wrap up on this.
Yeah. So I also want to encourage you folks to think about how you might take the exercise that we just did within the breakout rooms and bring those to your own department, right? In terms of building faculty buy-in, right? It's a great way to kind of crowdsource ideas and then think about this more broadly within your own institution as well. Ashley, do you want to wrap it up?
Yeah. Thank you all so much for today. This was a really wonderful webinar, workshop, event. And I just want to remind everyone that the slides will be made available and the recording of the webinar will be made available on the webinar webpage. And I'll be sending out the evaluation survey tomorrow, and that will be how you can access a certificate of attendance for this event. And unless there are any other questions, we are finished for today.
I will just add that our NSF project may also send out a second survey in another week or so. We're still working on our IRB approval to also just collect a little bit of data about your thoughts after participating in the workshop. And we'd really appreciate your feedback. Thank you all.